Here I am back in Visual Studio and my sample report runner application. So what I'm going to do is the application is going to get information about the report server and the folder we're interested in as app settings. So I need to add those settings to web.config. And then I'll also add a couple of models, which are essentially just classes that are going to hold information that I'll use in order to simplify some of the code that I'll write within the controller that actually is the interface essentially between user requests and the web service. All right, so the first thing I'll do is open up web.config, and notice that as part of the MVC application, even though it was the empty application that I created, I have a few app settings because MVC uses this for some of its convention over configuration settings, but it has to have a lot of infrastructure. If app settings wasn't there, I'd have to add that section as a child of configuration. But in this case, all I need to do is add a couple new keys. All right. Oh, also I'm going to do a Control KD. So that just organizes things. This is set up based on tabs, and I have my tab settings set a little bit differently from the person who originally created the code for this web.config file at Microsoft. So this now lines everything up nicely with my tabs. Okay, so I'm going to add a key, and the name of this key is going to be report server. And I'll add a value, and somehow I got an extra double quote in there. And this is the URL into my report server. So HTTP, and only 2 T's, localhost / report server. Okay, so now I can access that anywhere within the application. And it provides a single location where if I need to change what server I need to access, I just change it in this one place, and then all of my code will just work with that new server automatically. And then the other one I want to add is a key for the report folder. So again, report folder is the name that I'm going to use within the application. And I'm going to set this equal to sample reports. And in this case, I don't want the trailing slash. I could put it in there, but I'll take care of that within my application. Okay, I'm done with web.config, so I'll save that. And now I want to add those 2 models. So the way to do this within an MVC application is come over here to Solution Explorer, right-click on Models. The nice thing about this is if I put them in the correct location, then the MVC application knows where to find them. If I don't put them in the standard location, then I need to add additional code or at least additional keystrokes to identify the location in the namespace for these objects. Because this is actually going to get the model's namespace. So the classes that I put here within the folder are going to have the namespace of report runner, models, and then the name of the class. All right, so I'll go ahead and select add and class. If I want to add a different type of object, I could use new item, but in this case class is right here on the menu. And this is going to be my report view model. So that's what I'll name it. That's a common naming convention for these view models. Something unique, viewModel.cs, but use whatever naming standard works for you. Okay, I'll click on add, and that opens up the definition. Now, this report view model is going to be fairly simple for the application. But the first thing I need to do actually is add a using statement. I want to add using system.web.mvc. The reason I need this namespace is that, first of all, it's not already there, but a couple of the properties are going to have a type of select list. And this system.web.mvc namespace is where select list is implemented. So I need to include that. Now, the project already has a reference to this namespace, to that assembly. If it didn't, I would also have to add a reference to that assembly. Okay, so now I'll come down here and I'll add the properties. So these are going to be public properties. First one is report server. And I'm just going to use automatic properties, put in a get, oops. Okay, IntelliSense. It's not what I want. Oh, the reason it was confused is that I didn't put in a type. So let me identify the type. And now if I come in here, I can use a get and a set. Okay, sometimes, well, most of the time when I think IntelliSense is causing a problem, it's me who's doing something wrong. So yet another lesson. All right, save a few keystrokes. I'll copy this. All right, next thing I want is a place for the folder. Because again, this is the view model that is going to communicate between the controller and the view, the actual page, so that I can communicate to it where these things are located. And the purpose here really is to display them to the user. You may or may not do that within a real application. Okay, do string again, report folder, and then my property settings. And then here's where it gets a little bit interesting. So I'm going to create another public property, but this is going to be of type select list. So this is a class that is implemented within that system.web.mvc namespace that makes it really simple to populate drop-down lists on a view with collections of data. And we're going to have a drop-down list for the list of reports and the list of render formats. And so this is going to make it just the code almost trivial in order to display that to the user. Okay, so this is going to be called reports. And then another select list, call that formats. And I'll save. Okay, so that is the report view model. Again, this represents the data that I'm going to need to communicate to the view. The first two properties to display to the user so they know where this information is coming from, and the last two to populate the drop-down list boxes. All right, now I need to add another model. And I'll right-click on this and add and select class. And this one I'm going to name render format. Now the purpose of this class is to be able to send to the view an object that has two properties. One property is going to be the value of the selection when the user makes a selection, and the other is going to be the English name, some more meaningful, properly formatted, proper case kind of name to identify the format. The nice thing about this is that the web service, when I get a list of all the render extensions from the web service, I have both a name and a localized name version of the name of each of those extensions. Each of those render formats is what they amount to. And the name is what I need to use in order to send to the web service in order to identify how I want the format of the report. And the other one is the name that makes more sense to the user. Okay, so I'm going to add two properties here. Public string, localized name. Put in my get and set. And another string called just name. Oh, sorry, format name. Okay, and save my work. Okay, so that's going to make it easy to send the information to the view. And so you'll see a little bit later when I start implementing the code within the home controller how that's implemented, how I use this class. All right, so that's the model. I've added the app settings. I'm going to do a couple more things in this section. When I created this project, it was an empty ASP.NET MVC project. So I got the overall project structure, but I didn't get a default home controller. I didn't get a default view. If I go down here into views, you can see there's no default views. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is add a controller. I'm going to right-click on this, select Add, and Controller. And notice that I get this Add Scaffold dialog box. Scaffolding is Microsoft's term for essentially importing a bunch of code in order to support various kinds of things, operations, project structures. It takes on various meanings. So in this case, I'm going to add an empty MVC5 controller. But I could also do one with some default read-write actions. If I'm using an Entity Framework model, I could create one and it'll automatically populate it with a bunch of code for accessing data and updating data and so forth. And then the rest of these is to implement web APIs, which is essentially defining your own web services within this application. All right, so I'm going to use the empty one because I'm going to use this. I'm just going to have a single page for this application. So I'm going to use the index action method for everything I'm going to do. So I just keeping it really simple. All right, so I'll click on Add, and that prompts me for a name. Now the convention for the default controller is Home. So I'm going to follow that convention. I could name it something else, but then I would need to do some additional things in order to, when I ran the application, go to that controller. With Home controller, MVC knows to look for it, knows where to look for it. I don't have to do anything else. So it's the simplest way to implement the application. Click on Add, and we get this empty controller, which is really just a class. Now, even though I asked for an empty controller, it did give me this default action result called index. Now, really the reason it did that is because almost every time I add a controller, it's going to have an index. That's just the convention. I don't have to follow the convention, but I have to do more work if I don't. So this is convenient. I'm not going to have to type the few keystrokes to add that. I am going to change that statement, but it's going to have a fair amount of other code that's going to interact. This is where it's going to interact with the web service. And then I'm going to have an overloaded index method that is then going to respond to the request from the user. When they make a report selection, a format selection, request the report, that overloaded index method is where I'm going to handle the code to actually display the report to the user or let them download it or whatever is appropriate for the report format. All right, then the last thing I want to do as part of the infrastructure is create the view. Now, this is going to be a view based on a model, specifically the report view model that I created, this class right here. So MVC makes this easy. I'm going to right click within the body of this action method, select Add View, and it gives me a dialog box that prompts me for everything I need in order to create this view. Now the view name I'm going to leave as the default. That's the convention. If I do, then this index action method, MVC is going to know exactly where to find the index view. Makes it simple. Don't have to call it the same thing, but then I have to write some additional code in order to tell it where to find this view that I want to display. Okay. The template I want to use is for details, because I want to list the details of that report view model. And in order to do that, I need to specify a model class. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. In a typical new application that I'm creating the home controller afresh, I don't have very many classes. Maybe I have a view model or two or so forth. I'm not going to have a lot of classes. But this one does. Because what it's doing is it's picking up all of the classes, or at least most of them, of that web service, both web services. And so I have a lot of different classes that I can use here. And you can see that most of them are from the RS Management Web reference. As you scroll down, you'll see it's from other parts as well. Okay? So what I actually want is, I have to come all the way down here, a little bit further, report view model, right there. And so you can see I want the report view model. Even if there's a duplicate name someplace of report view model, I can verify that it's in the namespace that I want. In this case, the project name models, reportrunner.models. Okay, so that's the object I want. And I could create it as a partial view if this was going to be a view within a view. This is going to be a whole page, so I don't need to do that. I'm going to reference script libraries, which is going to pull in all of the features that MVC does by default for client-side stuff. And then I'll use a layout page. It's actually not going to use that because I don't have one, but so we'll get a default kind of ugly page, but that's okay. But so in a real application, I would have a layout page that provides headers and footers and menus and navigation and stuff like that. Okay, click on Add, goes out, looks at the properties of that view model, creates the scaffolding, creates that view file, and when it's done, presents me with this code. Now if we look over here in Solution Explorer, what it's done is here in Views, it's created that home folder, and I have that index.cs HTML. And of course, if I had chosen to write this in Visual Basic, it would have been index.vb HTML. See, because you can do everything in VB that you can do in C# for what I'm showing you. Okay, and as you can see, we have this report server, and it's displaying the value for it and the folder, and then it has a couple links at the bottom of the page.